Ray Robson played incredibly well in the rapid portion of the St. Louis Rapid and Blitz tournament, leading for much of that part of the tournament. And he had many impressive victories, including one over Alireza Firouzja. Well, this game was played later in the tournament during the Blitz portion. Now, let's see if Alireza can get his revenge on American Grandmaster Ray Robson. Robson had white, Alireza had black. D4, knight f6 was played, c4 and e6. Now, this particular move order, if white plays knight to c3, black can play the highly respected Nimzo-Indian defense. But here, white played knight to f3, and black responded with d5. And this particular move order is sort of played against the exchange variation, because in the exchange variation, usually white would like his knight to still be at g1, so he can play f3, followed by e4. So this is a move order designed sort of against the exchange variation. But Grandmaster Robson plays g3 instead, the Catalan system, and Firouzja checks on b4. Basically, this is designed to irritate white a little bit, draw the bishop to the d2 square, because the bishop doesn't really want to be here. The knight at b1 would rather be here. So after Firouzja retreats the bishop to e7, now white has to untangle these queenside minor pieces a little bit. Bishop g2, placing the bishop on the long diagonal. Castles, castles, knight b to d7. Now queen to c2, a very natural square in the Catalan, placing it in a position where it maybe take advantage of the potentially open c-file in the future. But c6 is played by Alireza, creating a strong point on d5. Perhaps later he can take on c4 and defend that pawn with b5. Bishop to f4, moving the bishop to a better square. a5, black gains space on the queen side. Rook to d1, placing the rook opposite black's queen and also adding to the defense of the pawn on d4. But Firouzja continues gaining space with a4. So white plays knight to c3, attacking that pawn twice. And so Alireza is giving that pawn up, but he grabs on c4 himself. Knight takes a4, and then knight to d5, threatening to grab the bishop pair with the bishop on f4. It may look like white can take this pawn on c4, but that doesn't work. In response, black would first take the bishop, then after pawn takes, play b5, forking the queen and the knight. Now, it looks like white's okay after queen takes c6 because he's counterattacking the rook at a8. The problem is he can actually take the knight with the rook. And after queen takes pawn at b5, black just plays rook to b4. That rook is defended by the bishop at e7. Queen moves, rook takes b2, and black is just up a minor piece. So he can't grab the pawn at c4. The knight goes back to c3, and now, boom, b5. That's the construction of pawns on the queen side that he wanted to begin with that pawn at c4 protected. In a previous game, a3 had been played, but here Robson plays a novelty, a4, immediately attacking that structure. b4 is not bad. After knight to e4, bishop to a6, defends the c4 pawn, and black has some nice queenside pawns. He plays queen to a5 instead, but after bishop d2, b4, he ends up with the same situation anyway. Knight to a4, e4, excuse me, bishop to a6. And these pawns on the queen side are quite strong. White could have played knight f to g5, trying to create some threats against h7, but instead he plays the knight to e5, hitting the knight at d7 as well as the pawn at c6. After knight e5, d e5, you can see white has a nice juicy, let's make that a green square, a nice juicy hole at d6. A move like rook f to d8 would have kept the knight out of that d6 square, but instead he plays h6 because the g5 square can be a very sensitive square in an attack on the king side. The downside of playing h6 is that white can now play knight to d6, which he does. And the idea of taking the knight and then attacking the pawn doesn't work very well because of e4. And when the knight moves, you can play e5, and the bishop is aiming at c6, and white has a pretty good position here. So instead, Firouzja plays c3, advancing his queenside pawns. After pawn takes, he takes with a knight, bishop takes knight, pawn takes. So black does have the bishop pair here. That's something, but of course white has that beautiful knight on d6, and now bishop takes c6. And here, Alireza makes a very committal decision. And had this game been a classical game or even a rapid game, it probably would have been a mistake. But in a blitz game, it's a playable idea, I think. Instead of just moving the rook away, which would have been a solid and reasonable option, he sacrifices the exchange by playing queen takes e5. And that, of course, makes the knight on d6 very vulnerable. But he has to give up the rook at a8, rook takes a8, and knight to b5. So what has Alireza gotten in exchange for giving up the exchange? Well, he has the bishop pair, and he has this far advanced c-pawn. Now, is that enough to make up for an exchange? In a long game, probably not. But in blitz, Ray Robson has his work cut out for him to contain black's active pieces. First, rook to c8. Alireza has to keep this pawn defended. That's an essential part of his plan. Rook to d7, moving the rook to the 7th rank and attacking the bishop, but bishop to f6. Now the bishop, queen, and rook are all defending the pawn at c3. Rook to b1, sort of backing up that knight at b5. And here Firouzja makes another interesting decision. Even though he's down material, he plays queen to f5, offering the exchange of queens. The point is he wants to break the blockade of the c-pawn so that it can advance even further. So queen takes queen, ef5, and rook to c1, attacking. And now here, what White would like to do now, let's say if White was on the move, he would want to play rook to c7 and just block that rook off from its defense of the c-pawn. But instead, Firouzja plays rook to c6, a very interesting move. And both sides were in pretty severe time pressure, and because of that, Ray Robson makes a blunder here. He plays the move rook to c7, and that does not work. If he had played, say, king to f1, he probably would have kept the advantage. But rook to c7 is a mistake, and this is the reason why. Firouzja takes the knight at b5, and that knight is the knight defending that rook, but the bishop that captures the knight also defends the rook on c6. That means he wins a pawn. So rook takes rook, bishop takes. Now, here's White's saving grace. He was already up in exchange, so he has a rook for two bishops. That's better for black, but it's not like White needs to resign. He has some chances to hold this position. First, he advances his a-pawn. Bishop to b5, stops the pawn's advance, and also attacks the e2 pawn. King to f1. The king shifts over. He wants to help in slowing down the c-pawn. King to f8. Now rook to b1, attacking the bishop at b5. If c2 here, after rook c1, bishop to a4, I think black would be in very good shape, and maybe White would consider resigning. But instead he plays bishop to c4, and now Robson plays a very strong move. Rook to b4, attacking the bishop on the c4 square. Obviously, if c2, you just take the bishop, and the rook would actually stop the pawn. Bishop to a6, rook to b6, bishop c4, again rook to c6. Placing the rook behind the passed pawn would be a pretty good idea for White. So instead, Alireza plays bishop to e6. And now we have these bishops controlling these squares. The problem is, now there's nothing slowing down the a-pawn. But king to e1 is played first. White is beginning to fight back. If he can lasso this c-pawn, he has a chance to hold. c2 is played. Now rook to b8 check, king to e7, and king to d2. And White has succeeded in grabbing the c2 pawn. There's really nothing black can do to protect it. Bishop c3 check. Obviously, he can't take the bishop because then he would promote with the queen. But king takes c2. And now it's the two bishops versus the rook, because obviously the pawn at a5 will fall. Can Robson hold with this rook against the two bishops? The problem is, of course, they're in time pressure, but the bishops are so tricky, and it's very hard not to land on a wrong square when you're facing that bishop pair. King to d1, king to f6, rook to b5, attacking the bishop at a5, bishop to c3, and now Robson makes a mistake. The best move here might be f3, but he plays rook to b6, and this is a blunder, and after the next move, the game is over. Bishop to d4. I'm not sure if Robson resigned or his clock ran out here, but it doesn't matter. Black is completely winning by attacking the rook at b6 and the pawn at f2. Rook b4, bishop takes f2, and this is a completely winning endgame for Alireza. So once again, he gets his revenge in the blitz portion for a loss in the rapid. Hope you enjoyed it. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.